Czech Center for Investigative Reporting and Dark Riviera present Protagonista, a war room content project hosted by Pavla Holcová. Protagonista puts investigative reporters at the heart of the story. Eva Jung is a Danish investigative journalist who, together with colleagues across Europe, uncovered a massive corruption scandal known as Azerbaijani laundromat. $2.9 billion was siphoned through European companies and banks, and the money was used to pay off Western politicians in an attempt to whitewash Azerbaijan's reputation abroad.
This was a different league than what we had worked on before, because we could see within the purposes of the transactions, real names were appearing. So names that sounded like European people. And it turned out to be, once we started Googling these names, that they were names of politicians.
Like?
So I remember the first person we had a look at was a guy called Edward Lindner. And Edward
From
Lindner,
Germany.
From Germany. So this Edward Lindner turned out to be a conservative politician who had been working from his seat in the Bundestag. And he also had this German, we would find out later, a German Azerbaijani friendship club. And he would go on election observation trips to Azerbaijan, to say whether this election was free and fair.
How could a person who is having German Azerbaijani friends group criticize elections?
That's true. So we just chose to call it what it is, a dictatorship.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
That's a nice shortcut.
Yeah. So we were able to show how this guy, Edward Lindner, would go to Azerbaijan. He would use his stance in Germany as a known politician to say, what we saw today was a free and fair election, just as we would have it in Germany. The day before the election, the Electoral Committee sent out a message saying the president has won again. So the people had not been at the voting, people had not been casting their ballot yet, and the day before, by a mistake, of course, they sent out the message saying the president has won again. So it's not exactly what you can call a free and fair election.
There was the case of the election app in Azerbaijan that showed the results a day before elections.
Yeah.
That was funny.
Yeah.
But okay, it was...
Or tragic.
or tragic, or both.
Yeah.
So this was pretty much the German standard of elections, according to Edward Lindner.
According to Edward Lindner, who would then 2 weeks after receive a big sum of money in these transactions that we had access to. So we saw the same case with other European politicians. They would be receiving money in these different banking transactions, and then at the same time, they would do different favors for the regime in Azerbaijan. So that might be acting in favor of the regime, so it might be to vote down a critical report on human rights in Azerbaijan, for instance. And we saw a few examples of that. There was a politician in Germany, there was a Slovenian, there was an Italian, there was a Belgian, there was another German, and these were all politicians that received money via bank accounts of Danske Bank Estonia. And really what the larger story in these different cases was that by not, stopping these transactions or telling the police about these transactions, Danske Bank let this money flow through from Azerbaijan to the different politicians, corrupting European politics.
So, did those politicians ever admit?
One of them, for instance, the Italian Luca Volonte, he went to trial in Italy because of this, and he was convicted of corruption.
What was the description of the transaction in the banking documents? Do you remember?
The description of the banking transactions for Luca Volonte was just his foundation.
Okay.
So his political foundation that he was the owner of.
So those were donations to political foundation?
Yeah.
Did he ever use the money from his own foundation for himself?
It was his foundation, so of course it was
he
his
kept
own
the
money. Yeah.
Any other cases of such an interest apart from European politicians?
For instance, we had 4 bank accounts, and 2 of these bank accounts where billions of kroner was just, flowing freely through these bank accounts. If Danske Bank had taken the time to look at who is the owner according to the official documents of these different companies, they would see that this is a guy who is just a refugee from Baku. Of course, he can't be a multi-billionaire.
I know I was working on one of the stories that were of deputy director of anti-corruption unit of Azerbaijan, and he invested 100 million euros into real estate in Czech Republic.
You might say it's tragicomic.
Yes, tragic and comic at the same time.
Tragic and comic at the same time, that the guy working to, free Azerbaijan of corruption, that he's also receiving crooked money from the state coffers.
Yeah, he was promoted after this story.
Yeah.
So I'm not really sure how it works in Azerbaijan. Okay, any other stories you can recall that you said like...
Yeah, of course there was the transactions leading to Rosoboron export, so a Russian weapons manufacturer. You remember Viktor Yanukovych, who was convicted of high treason, of corruption in Ukraine after he left as a president, probably living somewhere on Putin's in Putin land in Russia. So some of the money that he moved out of Ukraine went through companies that we could also see had been moving money through Danske Bank Estonia. At one point, we hear that allegedly a member of the Putin family has been sending money through Danske Bank Estonia. And, to begin with, you think that sounds weird, and can that be true? But we ended up spending a lot of time showing whether this happened, and in the end, we were able to find out that there had been whistleblower working in Estonia had warned the top management in Copenhagen that a member of the Putin family and the FSB had been moving money through bank accounts at Danske Bank. And the whistleblower had also been saying that the bank probably was helping launder money and itself probably committed crimes. This was a story that changed, I think, the whole way that this scandal was conceived around the world, because to begin with, people didn't really pay a lot of attention to our stories, not even in Denmark. And then, other Danish media
you need to add a celebrity, to the scandal.
Exactly. Igor Putin, the cousin of President Putin, that made a big difference on how this story was perceived. And that's also, I think, the first time we were quoted by Financial Times, one of the stories that we did. Yeah. So that made a big difference. So
Vladimir Putin was not really happy about your reporting?
He's one of his spokesperson spoke about this at one point of time, saying that this was not related to the president.
Okay.
I think that's the first time probably we've had a situation where the president had to take into consideration something we wrote or revealed at Berlingske, at least.
But tell me about the impact of the whole story. You have dictators, you have secret service, you have the family of Russian president.
It wasn't in our wildest dreams that we would, try to comprehend what would happen for the years to come. The impact of the reporting, we spent 2-3 years working on this case, and so many things happened. So the CEO stepped down, around 10 people at the top management stepped down because of this scandal. The stock plummeted with 13 billion euros.
What about the head of Estonian branch of Danske Bank?
So the former head of the branch of the Estonian bank, he was found dead in his garden. We don't know too much about what happened, but the official story is that he killed himself, hanged himself, and it can't help but make a big impression on you, of course. And
how did you feel guilty?
That
you put him in a position that
you can't help but feel very sad for the people he left behind, but feel guilty? No.
So, do I understand it right? By this reporting, you pretty much pissed a lot of very powerful people from Russia, from Azerbaijan, arms dealers.
I think it's safe to say that a lot of people were reading it with a big interest.
Did you feel somehow threatened when reporting on such a cases? Because those people don't want to be seen. Those people don't want to, explain themselves.
So we did a lot of things to protect our sources. We would only speak ourselves amongst us in either face to face or on encrypted lines. We would also give our sources different code names, never talking about their real names. We would, in different ways, be attentive of how we met them. In modern day, we leave digital traces all around. Our phones, our phone calls, our payments with credit card, that sort of thing. So we would do everything we could to not leave any traces. For instance, fly out to the country in question, and then we would buy train tickets with cash. And we would make sure to bring cash, so we wouldn't use the credit card at the destination in question. We would turn off our phones, or we would leave our phones at home. We would meet sources at a gas station.
Isn't it just like two movie-style meeting sources at a gas station?
Well, sometimes as a journalist, you can get your inspiration from great movies, can't you? But for instance, meeting a source at a gas station and saying, I'm in a white car, you're going to be in a black car. We'll wait for each other here, and then when the car shows up, you'll just ride after the car for a few hours and meet somewhere secludedly, making sure no one's following you. So we did take great care to make sure that our sources were not revealed. Actually, there was a point of time where we heard from inside Danske Bank that they had asked the IT people to check out if anyone at the bank had been downloading Signal encryption app. And yeah, you can just guess why they needed to understand why any employees or bosses had been downloading.
Poor guys who did it randomly, just to communicate with grandma or something.
Yeah.
So what do you do if you feel exhausted, if you feel like someone is really trying to get to my phone, someone may be following me, someone may be willing to do harm to me? What do you do? Like it's not a mental state that you can live for long.
So one thing is, of course, good colleagues that you can speak to and talk through things that are difficult, if you feel under a lot of pressure. But another thing I like to do is to go for a run and just clear your head in the woods or by the sea or whatever's possible, and think about something else.
Can you talk about this kind of stories with your family members or partners or...
No, I can't, because the information that you give, the information that people give you is sacred, and, people are taking a lot of risk to speak to journalists, so you have to show them the respect to take good care of the information that they give you.
Let's get back, like you've been working on this story, you've been, writing those stories, and then, you published. How does it feel when you press the button, publish?
When we published the Azerbaijani laundromat, I remember this was a really big day for us, and it was a big day for our newspaper Berlingske as well, because we're just a small Danish newspaper. But by that time, because it was a leak that we obtained, we could see, The Guardian and Süddeutsche and Le Monde and big newspapers around Europe. They would be writing that this is the story that came to life because Berlingske got access to this leak, and that was exhilarating, definitely.
So you publish, and then what? Then you go for a beer, or just say goodbye, see you tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp, or...
Yeah. So we were sitting at the newspaper. I think it was 8 o'clock at night, a Sunday night, that we broke this story, and this was a huge story for us. We'd been working on it for months, and we would just sit. And once the story came out, we would just be, checking out all the different websites of all these European newspapers, and we had bought some beer and congratulating each other on good work. And then our colleagues around Europe would also send a picture of them having a beer. And
I definitely remember sending the photo of my beer, on Sunday at 8 p.m.
And we would relax for half an hour or so, but then we had to start working on the stories for the next days.
At 9 p.m.
Yeah. The first big story, that's the hardest, and you work towards it until you publish it, and you think, now I'm done, but then all the hard work starts, because then all the different, consequences and impact and all the stories that you have to keep pushing, it's, the hard work continues. It was, it feels like you don't need so much sleep in that, in the period of times where you work on these cases, because it's just takes over your life a little bit.
What was the reaction of the bank? You published a really... It's a story that can really, shut the bank off,
The reaction of the bank was quite clear. They said that what had been going on in Estonia was worse than what they feared. And because of this, they would now start a big legal examination into what had been going on and what sort of cash flows had been running through the bank. And in the end, this was an investigation that would last for a year. It made it possible for the bank to say every time we had a story, we can't talk about this because we're investigating it.
Easy way out.
Yeah.
When working on this Azerbaijani laundromat, there's one thing I realized was very different to my experience working as investigative reporter, and that was that the bank, when you ask them something, they always replied.
Yeah.
And they were super polite. It's pretty much telling the journalist to fuck off, but in a very polite way. So what is your experience with the nice reply?
What can you say? It was sort of a drip tactics. They would give us a little bit of information, and then a while after we would be able to show. They didn't at all show us the whole picture. So they would say things like, we noticed this money laundering at Estonia ourselves, and then we reacted clearly, and we closed down these customers. And then a while after, we would be able to show, actually, it wasn't themselves who had noticed this. They had received several warnings. It was a whistleblower, or it was a correspondent bank, or that sort of thing. And they hadn't closed down all these customers. It actually took them 2 years to close down, and the FSA, the financial authorities, had to tell them to speed up. Or they would say this only happened in Estonia, and we would be able to show it didn't only happen in Estonia. It also happened in the other Baltic countries. They were very polite and civil, but still they weren't telling us the whole truth, or the truth.
You saw there are really dangerous people involved in the bank transfers. What about the sources? Because those information they provided you with, it can get them killed.
Yeah. Normally with the sources like this, they are afraid either of getting fired or getting dragged to court because of confidentiality agreements, that sort of thing. But what we realized pretty quickly working on the Danske Bank Estonia case was that they were afraid of more than that. They were afraid of physical reprisals or repercussions. So one of them, a few bankers in Estonia, told us the story about lawyers showing up at the branch. So these lawyers were pissed that the bank wanted to close down a few accounts. And these guys said, we're lawyers representing our clients. And the guys working at the Estonian branch, they grew up in the Soviet Union. And they said they didn't look like lawyers. And they didn't have lawyer hands. And they didn't talk like lawyers. So they said, growing up in the Soviet Union, they knew how the KGB looked like. And these guys, the lawyers in question, started getting aggressive, saying, you shouldn't close down these bank accounts. and you should watch yourself when you go home at night. So that was a case that made it very evident that the people moving money through Estonia were not your normal customers.
And the bank still considered it a good idea to service those people?
I think at that point of time they were trying to sort of realize what can we do to close down these accounts, but it made it very difficult.
So are you ever, question if you don't work for Secret Service? Because it's very common, among investigative reporters that once in a while someone is telling them, blaming them that they work for Secret Service, CIA,
I don't think anyone asked us if we worked for the Secret Service, no.
Do you?
No.
Okay. Was there any time in the investigation when you wanted to give up?
We analyzed more than 100,000 bank transactions during these years, and that can be really tiresome and boring. But of course, then you find the transactions that are really interesting, and then it's great again. It's that's how it goes.
What would happen if you would never report this story about Danske Bank?
That's a good question. But at the point of time where we started working in this in 2017, no one in Denmark really knew that Danske Bank had a branch in Estonia. I think it's a good guess. It's a safe guess that probably no one would know about this case today.
Yeah.
I think the Danske Bank case changed the landscape of the financial institutions, not only in Denmark, but in Europe in general, along with the other cases of crooked banks at the time. Thousands of people were hired in Denmark to work with just compliance and money laundering within the banks. So it gave, a whole new awareness as to be attentive to money laundering. And
does it work?
I think there's a big attention towards money laundering in Denmark at the moment. I mean, the police gets so many different suspicious activity reports. But of course, that only means that the crooked money moves to other institutions, other places. So
to Czech Republic, for example.
To Czech Republic, for instance, or banks in China or banks in other places outside the EU.
Is there any concept about investigative reporting that you would like to go away? That general public just don't understand?
I don't know.
That it could be really boring.
I think people were surprised how much, for instance, transactions that we looked at the banking scandal at Danske Bank. So they were like, do you know how much 100,000 banking transaction is and how much time it takes to go through that? Maybe sometimes it's difficult to grasp how much work goes into just, one news item and how much attention to detail we pay and how much we try to make sure that we don't make any mistakes at all. I think one of the things that happened during this case was that a moment that you have not anticipated as a journalist was sitting down with a glass of champagne, New Year's Eve 2018. And in Denmark, we have a monarchy. And we had a monarch for 50 years called Queen Margrethe. And she does a New Year's speech every year. Almost all Danes sit down in the beginning of the evening to listen what the monarch has to say. Take into consideration this in your everyday life. And she'll say it in a sort of broad manner so that everyone can use it for something. But at one point of this New Year's speech, she said that it makes her sad if moral is sliding and people in trusted positions should do their best and that sort of thing. And I was sitting and I was thinking, is she talking about Danske Bank? And she was. A direct comment of, one of the big old institutions, a bank from 1871, 20,000 people work there. it's really, a pillar of society in many ways. And here you have the Queen saying, this is not good enough. You should make sure that keep on your high horse and, do better. And that was just a situation that you don't anticipate as a journalist, that the Queen will be also, so many things happened. So it's a good story, good reporting.
Thank you.